where does improvement in photography actually hide? Some say improvement is about knowing all the techniques, all the settings, and all the specs of your gear so well that you can use them with your eyes closed. And yes, I think that is important, because all of these things can help you take a good photograph. But what 10 years of photography on the streets have taught me is something a little more abstract and yet somehow more specific. So for the next few minutes, bear with me, because in that short amount of time, I want to share 10 years of street photography lessons that might change not only the way you shoot, but also how much you enjoy the craft. While I was writing the script for this video, probably about 3 coffees in for the day, I was thinking how to start telling this story. Do I start with the more complicated things first and leave the simplest stuff for later, or do I do the opposite? Well, I decided to start with the simplest things because sometimes the simplest things are not the most obvious. We often avoid simplicity because we think that people don't need to hear it, or maybe they don't need to see it for that matter. But funnily enough, it took me 10 years to realize that simplicity is probably the answer. To understand that, when I bury myself in more choices, more cameras, more lenses, more options, I end up mastering none of them. And more importantly, I don't end up using them for what they really are. It is like locking myself in taster mode again and again and again, but never giving myself enough time to enjoy the full meal. That is why now I narrow things down to one camera and one lens for each period of work, depending on the vision I have in mind and the body of work I want to create. Because deciding what your body of work is going to say is far more complicated than choosing a camera. And if you bury yourself in gear choices before you even decide what you're going to say, you're losing the game from the start line. But gear is not the most important thing that needed simplification. There is something else that is way more important. For once, in photography, having an idea works a little bit like writing a sentence. When you write, you don't just add random words one after the other. You start with an idea, and then you choose the right words to help you shape that idea. In photography now, when you're working on something specific, it helps to leave the house with a direction in mind. Not a strict plan that kills all spontaneity. I mean, it wouldn't be street photography if you had that. But you go out with a visual idea that give your eyes somewhere to go. For example, maybe you're creating a collection about flowers and plants that you see in people's windows or front yards. You might start with something simple, maybe a nice plant in a nice light. But then you begin to build on that idea. Next, you might photograph a plant behind a window. And then you might photograph a plant behind a textured window. Then maybe you combine that with movement, reflections, or a slower shutter speed. And just like that, something that started as a simple subject becomes something with a lot more depth. So if you have a specific idea, it focuses the mind and it gives the walk a purpose. And at least for me, it makes the whole experience a lot more fulfilling. And that brings me to the next point. Each photograph has its own purpose. And that doesn't mean to look nice. Let me explain. Let's go back to our writing analogy. Street photography is like a book with unlimited stories. Some stories are more complicated. They involve people, layers, actions, and at the end of the day, they have something very clear to say. But not all stories are loud. Some stories are quieter. They're about simple things. It could be a chair on the corner of the street under interesting light, or the shape of a shadow and its relationship with the people passing by, or maybe a tree that is slowly disappearing into the fog. These photographs are important too. It's funny because when I started, I used to think that the simpler shots are the most important ones. Then I changed my mind and started wanting more complexity, more layers, and more obvious meaning. Now I finally understand that each photograph has its own purpose. Some photographs tell a story. Some photographs just please the eyes. Some photographs are there to just create mood. And some photographs are simply bad photographs. But these are also important because they teach you what doesn't work. Or even better, they become lucky accidents, and they reveal something unexpected. So the point is not to force every photograph to do the same thing, but to understand what each photograph is trying to say. And also, when repeating the same thing is not something to be avoided, but exactly what the photograph is asking for. But does repeating the same thing makes you lazy? Let's have a look. I tend to be quite harsh on myself when I'm not coming up with new ideas and new exciting things all the time. I do it with my YouTube videos, but I also do it with my photography. I feel that in recent years we have been persuaded that we always need to create something that looks like nothing else out there. That repeating ourselves is wrong and that we have to stop immediately. But you know what? I think repetition is very important. First, because it helps you improve a specific skill or a specific type of photograph. And second, because through repetition you start to discover alterations and variations, quite small, but they start becoming quite unique to you. If you have ever tried to learn a musical instrument, you know exactly what I mean. When I was learning to play the piano as a kid, I used to repeat the C major scale again and again and again until I was able to play it fluently. The same applied to classical pieces. Today I don't remember how to play any of that, but what I do remember is improvisation. I remember how to press the keys and I remember how to make the sound make sense. And in a sense, this is all I need to create something that never existed before. But that freedom didn't come from avoiding repetition. It came from countless repetitions. But improvisation couldn't be the mother of all creativity without this next lesson. If this way of thinking about photography is something that is useful to you, please hit the like button and consider subscribing with the bell. This helps me a lot to grow this channel, but it also tells me that you like this type of videos, so I can keep making them. During my first years taking photos on the streets, I remember me taking photos and then immediately looking at the screen, trying to examine every detail. Sometimes I would admire them, sometimes I would hate them, but in both cases I think that was the wrong behavior. Nowadays, unless I have a very specific vision and I'm trying to build a frame step by step, I tend not to look at my screen too much. First, because obsessing over what went right or what went wrong can distract you from enjoying the process, but also because it disrupts the flow. I don't know about you, but when I'm out in the streets, it takes some time to get into the zone. And when I'm there, I have to keep shooting, I have to keep observing, and I have to keep creating. Because if I suddenly stop and start judging everything, that creative space can disappear very quickly. So I try to stay in the moment, try not to worry too much about what just happened or what is about to happen. And there is another thing. It makes me really exciting to know that there might be something in those frames that I never noticed when taking them. It could be small details, people, gestures, expressions, all of those nice things. And I want to take my time properly when I'm at home, looking at those images and trying to discover them from the beginning. But there is always a but. When I finally sit down and observe my photos, I have to do it carefully, because it is very easy to fall into the trap the next lesson taught me to avoid. After taking a photograph we like, we often feel the need to explain it, to give it a name, to give it a meaning, to make it understandable. But sometimes when we explain a photograph too quickly, we take something away from its magic. Because the moment we decide that the photograph means only this one thing, we start narrowing down all the different paths that the photograph could take. And that narrows the photograph down to one path. But the photograph is not one path. A photograph is a moment in time, but that moment can open up into countless others. It can mean one thing to me, another thing to you, and a completely different thing to someone else. There were countless times when I tried to explain one of my photographs in a certain way, and then I showed it to my partner or to a friend, and they came up with a much better narrative. Or at least a narrative that I would have never seen on my own. So maybe the potential of a photo is starting to get lost when we try to overinterpret it. The point I'm trying to make is that a photograph is a collection of countless moments that converge into a single frame, and then diverge into countless possible meanings. So take it for what it is, spend some time with it, let it exist, let it remain a little mysterious, because not every photograph needs to be explained to matter. But when does narrowing down the meaning of a photograph actually matters? I think it becomes important when the photograph is placed within a greater context. As we said earlier, it is important to have a goal when going out. It is important to repeat things, but that doesn't mean that you should constantly aim for the same type of photograph every time you go out, or that you should dedicate yourself to a very specific idea forever. You can do that, of course, if it is what you like, but we're creative beings and many different things might take your fancy. That is why at some point I started creating buckets. Not literal buckets, of course, but thematic ones. I created these buckets around the types of photographs I like to take. For example, I love photographing people intertwined inside complicated frames where everything comes together in some kind of organized chaos. So I made a bucket for that. Now, I also love photographing birds interacting with people in unexpected ways inside the frame. So I made another bucket for that. And just like that, I have ended up with around 12 different buckets, each one of them built around a different idea. This helps me focus without becoming trapped. It narrows my gaze down to only those things that matter to my own creative goals, while still allowing me to move between different ideas depending on what the streets give me each time. And one thing that becomes very clear with buckets is how I actually edit my photos. When I first got into photography and editing, I used to over-edit my photos. Each photograph would have its own colors, its own contrast, its own edit, its own mood. And as a result, I ended up with many images that, when placed next to each other, made no sense at all. So quite embarrassingly, only recently, I stopped doing that. Instead of trying to find a different edit for each photograph, I now try to edit each photograph according to the body of work it belongs to. For example, all my highlights and shadows photographs usually have the same warm and contrasty edit. But my folk photographs have a softer blue and brown edit because this bucket belongs to a different visual world. This way I still allow myself to be creative, but the creativity now has some structure. The photographs can be different, but they still feel connected. They still speak the same visual language. Okay, now for the last two, stay with me and let me take you somewhere else. Somewhere where street photography feels less like a project that requires completion and more like something playful, something meaningful, something that keeps us curious, engaged, and give us a reason to go out beyond the photographs. So I stopped making every photo walk about the photos. Some photo walks are simply not about the camera and the clicks. Some photo walks are about balance, mental balance, about exercising my ability to be present, about processing everything that is happening in my life. And that is okay. The key word here is acceptance. To accept that some photo walks are about the second part of the word, the walk. Sometimes I come back home with photos. Sometimes I come back home with a clearer head. And to be honest, both are valuable. And that brings me to my last and probably the most important point of them all. Every now and then I will get a comment from someone saying that my photos in a specific video would not be on par with my photos on other videos. And my reaction to those comments is usually the same. Yes, that's probably true. It is true because I'm not always producing portfolio shots. I'm not always getting my best photographs. Some weeks my photos are better, some weeks my photos are worse, and some weeks they are almost non-existent. And I want to share exactly that. If I only showed you my best work, I don't think I would be honest with you. Because the value of what I'm sharing here is way beyond the final photograph. It is in the process, in the reality, the imperfect shots, the thoughts, the philosophies, the realizations, the growth, both photographic but also mental. Because I think that the beauty of photography doesn't only hide in the beautiful frames. It also lives in how our thirst for beautiful frames grows every time we don't get them. When I take 1,000 bad photos, I feel happy. Because I know that probably the photo 1001 will end up being something quite unique. Something that will make all those other failures worth it. So keep walking, keep enjoying it, keep being creative, regardless of how your photos look today. Because that one shot that makes everything worth it might hide just around the corner. Is there any lesson that you have learned that I haven't talked about today? Do you agree with mine? Do you disagree? Let me know down in the comments, let's have a chat about it. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe with the bell, or consider becoming a member to support the work behind these films. And if you want to see how I use light to create my highlights and shadows project, click and watch this video next. That was all for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I will see you on the streets. Bye bye.